The Soviet Empire didn't fall in a day. Neither did its tributaries and satrapies. Some ended peacefully, others very peacefully. Obviously, there was some sort of variance between societies that led to these diverse outcomes, and it wasn't just Ceausescu's good looks. In fact, it was probably despite it. I mean, who wouldn't want this man to control your means of reproduction? As each state participated in their own socialist screenplay, there came about a milieu of differences in the ways each society was structured. These differences revolved around one psychological political concept: the existence, or lack thereof, of a civil society. I will examine the concept of the civil society in a three-part series. Through this series, I will explain civil society and show how the civil society system allowed for the gradual transition in Poland and Hungary, from evil communist dictatorships into a free and democracy-loving present. A civil society is a concept as old as political science itself. Like most Western thought, we can find the genesis of the civil society meme in the conversations with the elusive kid corrupter, Socrates. Socrates, being a man of his time, and a man of his time he was, taught that political conflict ought to be resolved with an entirely new concept called dialogue. Dialogue, as we think Socrates defined it, is a political dialectical discourse, which is a bunch of mumbo-jumbo for arguing about how the polis should operate. Plato, Socrates' favorite sub, refined the meme of dialogue so it seemed less blatantly obvious by actually writing it down. Plato wrote his dialogues where he takes philosophers from the Athenian intellectual scene and has them debate each other in a Socratic dialogue style. The dialogues that Plato wrote include some famous ones like Euthyphro, which is a dialogue about the will of the gods, and everyone's favorite prologue to the Communist Manifesto, The Republic, which is a dialogue about justice, poetry, and this really weird cave, among other memes. Now Plato had an intellectual sub of his own, Aristotle, who first formally defined what a civil society was in his work, The Politics, where he called it the political community, or koinonia politik in Greek, which is the community centered around the polis, or city. Drawing from Socrates, Aristotle believed the purpose for the civil society was to create a dialogue between rulers and the ruled. Aristotle claimed this dialogue and the process of both ruling and being ruled was the most important virtue, as it allowed man to create the condition where he could work towards the highest good. Without the virtue of not shutting up, man would deteriorate into a state of incessant warfare, as it would be the only means to obtain any kind of power or concessions to oneself. The concept of civil society was furthered by a civilization that actually enjoyed the company of women, the Romans. Cicero, or Cicero for you Romaboos, was a Roman statesman that propelled the concept of the civil society by calling it civil society, or societas civilis in Latin. Throughout his work, Cicero explored the concept of civil society and what made Rome different from the filthy, baby-sacrificing, garum-less barbarians. Being Roman and not Greek, Cicero believed that the civil society did not just belong to one pole, but rather, civil society was a community that made up the governance of the whole society. Just like the Roman Empire was an empire that expanded beyond the capacity for one central city to govern, Cicero's concept expanded beyond one distinct community. After Cicero, there was, well, not much. As the western half of the empire fell, European society completely restructured. Instead of transnational politicians and demagogues that stole from the poor, requisitioned land, raped and pillaged, there were local ones. And because of this, governance was invested in bodies rather than concepts. The European medieval era saw a rise of what became later known as a feudal system, or a hierarchy of knights, dukes, kings, etc., that legally controlled governance of their dominion. But the concept of civil society did not end there.
You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward.
With Aristotle and Cicero, we can see a formal definition of civil society developing. However, the concept of civil society was not fully formed in Western antiquity. European classical philosophers did not differentiate between society and the state. Now it is in modernity where philosophers figured out that there are social aspects other than politics, a concept that still baffles poli-sci majors today. The pause in this particular social development ended with the Peace of Westphalia, a treaty that finalized the 30 Years' War, a war that indeed lasted 30 years, and is considered one of the most devastating wars in history, even in Germany, which really counts for something.
Right, well, I think that concludes our treaty. Gentlemen, a toast. Peace in Europe.
Peace in Europe.
With the Treaty of Westphalia and its implications came a new idea that revolutionized statecraft the world over, the idea of the state, or a territory that is controlled by the laws and decrees of a government. And in this era, the governments were mostly controlled by a monarch. So it was basically the same as before, but without the hierarchy and more centralization.
War never changes.
The centralization process became the main theme of Western Europe during the 17th and 18th century, as some arrogant scientists that called themselves enlightened started to ask pesky questions such as, what is the purpose of the state? Why should it be controlled by a monarch? And, oh God, why are you chopping off my head? But it is with these questions and sacrifices to the world that brought the rational civilization we have today.
But you have no plan.
Oh, I do.
Secretary,
in fact,
you have no plan.
A book about
Chief among these Enlightenment philosophers were two Englishmen, Hobbes and Locke, who both tried to find which structure of the state would lead to the most liberal society, or a society that a civil society, in its essence, dialogue, could prosper. Hobbes argued in his Leviathan, one of the most misunderstood political works of all time, that an absolutist government, a government that was embodied by a single man and inherited, would lead to the freest society. Locke argued that a constitutional state, a state that was controlled by a monarch and beholden to a legislature, would lead to the freest society. Neither were heeded, as in the late 18th century, the Enlightenment manifested into republicanism and began sweeping Europe and North America. The American and French revolutions revolutionized the concept of civil society. Ready-made republican institutions supplanted existing monarchical ones, and it seemed as if the civil society was different and in opposition to the existing regime. The German philosopher Hegel was the first to point out this disunion. This led to the only tolerable Frenchman in history, Tocqueville, who made the observation that the civil society, or associations, as he put it, does not only happen within or about the state, but can be decentralized even further, as it was when he toured the fledgling United States, and encompass all other aspects of social life. In our modern understanding, the civil society and state are, depending on the type of government, separate entities, and the former is a vehicle that informs and changes the latter. Now that I got that out of the way, I can dive into the real meat and potatoes. In this video, I only focused on civil society as it manifests in the West. But this was not to say the institution did not exist elsewhere, but rather, I wanted to show how the evolution of the concept affected the minds and ideals of Poles and Hungarians in the Soviet era. My next two videos.